Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to episode 2 of our journey through time here in the English Riviera UNESCO Global Geopark. Now in today's episode we've changed location, so we're heading to Hope's Nose today. So we're going to find out more from some experts and also meet some of the team within the Geopark itself. So let's head on down to the beach and see what they have to say. Lovely to see you again.
Oh, hi, good to see you.
How have you been?
Yeah, really good.
Great to have you back on the channel.
Oh, it's really good to be back.
So where are we stood right now?
We are stood at Hope's Nose, Site of Special Scientific Interest, one of the most fantastic sites we have here in the Geopark.
Oh, we're so excited to be here to continue this awesome series that we're doing with you guys. One thing I wanted to find out a little bit more is about the Geopark itself. And could you tell us a little bit, what is a global geopark?
The UNESCO Global Geopark is really based upon internationally significant geology. You have to have that. I hate the pun, as the bedrock of the designation. So from that point, geoparks really are about helping people link with, understand this amazing planet that we live on from deep time all the way through to today. So it's the influence the geology's had on everything else that's happened, from the plants we see around us. Difference in the geology has shaped the bay. That shape of the bay, the protection of those arms, has influenced everything that's happened here since, from the fishing industry developing over at Brixham to the rich soils being able to be farmed. Obviously, Kent's Cavern became a fundamental place for early man. The position of that cave entrance facing east meant that it had the early morning sun, was a beautiful spot to warm up in the morning. So the influence of the geology has affected everything. And geoparks are all about celebrating that and helping people to use the past to understand the future as well.
And I mean, you touched on a few different types of heritages there, and that's one thing that makes this geopark so spectacular, is we don't just have spectacular geology, of course, which we'll be showing everyone through this series, but there's also other things going on. Anthropology side of things is incredible within this geopark, and then you've got the interaction of the biodiversity as well around us. There's a lot going on. It's a really lovely place to visit.
And of course archaeology as well, with Pengelly's excavations of Kent's Cavern and the development of the grid system and the use of that in the cave. It's a fundamental place. We're very small, but we're very significant.
Definitely. And then you've got all the connections to Agatha Christie as well, that people might not know about. So there's a lot going on.
So
and
that element of how the bay's inspired people over the years as well. So Agatha Christie obviously had very favourite spots in the bay. She enjoyed wild swimming. She had favourite beaches. And in the books, you can see reference to these places. She's called them different names, obviously, but they're very, very recognisable as being here.
Oh, it's lovely that, this is the place that sparked that inspiration, and perhaps for future writers it will do the same, which is lovely.
Yeah.
So a range of heritages, but if we focus on geo-heritage here, could you talk us through a little bit about geo-conservation and the importance of such a thing?
Yeah, obviously, if with a UNESCO designation, you have to ensure that your geology is looked after, is conserved, as with your biodiversity and marine biodiversity as well. So our sites are protected. We have a range of designations: the sites of special scientific interest, the regionally important geological sites, and those sites are managed by different organisations in the bay, but predominantly Torbay Coast and Countryside Trust does the management of these sites. And we have regular reviews that happen and monitoring of these sites to check their condition. So we've got the Natural England cover the triple SIs, and then we have a wonderful report written that assesses and gives us all of the updates on and recommendations on how they need to be managed going forward as well. So it's that ongoing management of the place that's really, really important. And that's the same for all of the geoparks around the world. There's 213 now across the globe. I think 48 countries. And that will soon increase again because every year new applications come forward, and I think we're expecting another 16 to join very soon. So that's very exciting. Potentially another one for the UK.
Oh,
which
fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. So it's really fantastic to see this network really grow and thrive.
Definitely. And I mean, it's lovely to see the geo conservation in action only quite a few months ago now, but a few months ago we were at Walton Cove for a very exciting event.
Yeah.
I'll link that down below for any of you who haven't watched that dig where we were taking out, fossil tree fragments, and they ended up at the Talking Museum to be curated. And it's nice to see the whole process that goes in, because those really special pieces, they do need to be conserved. And sometimes that's inside a museum rather than in situ, but it's special cases and the right permissions have to be obtained.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a coverall of sort of like no hammering here because of the nature of the site, the finite nature of the geology we have. It's really important that we look after it and it can remain in situ, unless, of course, like Salton, it was at risk of loss from erosion from the sea, and that was a case of we've got to get into action here and make sure that doesn't get lost to science. So that was probably one of my most exciting days as a Geopark coordinator, to be honest, to be able to rescue that fossil.
Oh, amazing. And it was so lovely for me to be a part of it as well and be a part of the team excavating it. So talking of fossils and rocks, we're going to go find Kevin now on the beach, I think, to see the life and death of a Devonian reef system. So let's go see what he's up to.
Brilliant.
This is an amazing slab here. It's fallen out of the cliffs behind us. So, of course, this is why we're wearing helmets, because things do fall out of cliffs. But it shows lots and lots of fossils. And this is from the oldest rocks in Torbay. These are about 400 million years ago. They date from the later part of the Lower Devonian. And they're known as the Meadfoot Group, after a very nice beach just around the corner from here. But this slab is absolutely full of fossils. There's bits of coral. You can see the radiating internal structure. There's bits of shell here. There's some interesting black pebbles, which I'm not quite sure what those are. There's always things which are one's not quite sure about. Lots of corals, more shells there. And this is really interesting. This is a very particular, 9-inch marker there. It's a type of coral called Pluridictium problematicum. It's almost like a limpet sort of size. And it was actually a mobile coral. They reckon these could move around and maybe sort of crawl like a limpet just over the sediment.
They're still with like a suction kind of foot.
Yeah, sort of something like that, moving along. But often they have a worm, symbiotic worm on top. So the coral is crawling around and this worm is just taking a ride and feeding. That's why they're called problematicum, because when they first found them, they didn't really know what they are. But they're an indicator of the end of the Lower Devonian. So it's not only a really interesting, bizarre fossil, it also tells us how old the rocks are. But there's also something very interesting on the edge of the block here. I mean, all these types of shells tend to suggest moderately shallow water. It's grey, so it's muddy, so it's not very shallow because the mud gets washed away. But there is an amazing chambered shell here. This is a cephalopod, so relatives of nautiloids and indeed ammonites and squids. So the chambers are part of the internal structure, which allows it to go up and down in the water like a submarine. But this means there was connection to deep water, because back in the Devonian period of time, these things are only found in deep water. Okay. Later, they moved into shallow water. So we've got evidence here of a moderate depth of deposit, which is really interesting. And so these are the oldest rocks in the bay, and we've got them in the cliff behind us as well. You can see bands. There's slaty, there's muds which have been turned into slaty rocks. And then you've got bands of sandstone, which are the ones which stick out as ribs. So you've got sort of changes in the environment, and the sandstones indicate periods of sort of shallowing of the water. And they have a very, very famous type of sedimentary structure called hummocky cross stratification. When I was a student, everyone was trying to find HCS everywhere. But it's a sort of layers in the rock, sort of bowl-shaped, overlapping layers, which what happens when you have a storm goes by. The water is moving around. It's not moving the sand from one place to another. It's moving it around like some this. And you get this layered structure, which indicates storms. So sometimes it was a bit deeper and sometimes it was shallow. Well, actually, there is some cross stratification here in this rock. These layers here, this is sandstone. It's looking paler than the grey clays of the slaty mud rock in between. And there's actually layers within it. And when sands form, sands get washed in by currents, and they often form in layers. A classic structure is cross-bedding, where like a sand wave is driven along in the water, and the sand is cascading over the top of it and forming like a series of parallel lines, which means the current is moving in a certain direction. But in the storm, the currents, no so much about currents, the water's moving backwards and forwards. So you get these strange sort of low angle sorts of layers as the sand is deposited in overlapping sort of bodies. And this might actually be it in here. It's a very low angle layering, bedding, which is related to how this was actually deposited. And that could actually be it. Now, I'm not an expert sedimentologist, so someone else would need to come and check this. But this does look like a storm-deposited sandstone with this classic HCS.
So we've now moved further along the beach, but only by about 20 to 50 metres, would you say? But these rocks here look quite different to what we were seeing behind us a second ago. What's going on with these?
Well, they are very different. Over there, we saw like darker layers, some mud-rich layers alternating with thin bands of sandstone. But this, actually massive thick bands of sandstone, instead of like maybe most 30 centimetres, these are several metres thick, and it's completely different. We know from relationships in the area, this is a unit which lies above the Meadford group over there. So it's slightly younger, but it's been brought down by a fault here. But this isn't supposed to be here. This was actually mapped. These sandstones were mapped at the end of the 19th century by the great W.A. Usher, a mapping pioneer, after whom a regional geological association is named. So he has compared them to the Staden beds, or Staden Formation in Plymouth, and he mapped it all around the hilltops here. When the Geological Survey came along the end of the last century, and they published at the beginning of this century, they didn't see this. They didn't see this on the outcrop on the beach down here. They obviously didn't come down here. And all the areas of the hilltops where Usher mapped it, they were now covered by buildings. So they didn't see the Staden group, so they didn't map it. So the new maps don't have this on there. But there's also another interesting question as well. When the Geological Survey had sort of mapped a previous area in Plymouth, they came up with a model of the tectonic evolution of the area as a series of separate basins. And each basin had a distinct set of rocks. These, according to them, are rocks of the Loo Basin, which is over there, not here. So it would have been inconvenient, I'm afraid, to map these in this area. So they've sort of like subtly disappeared from the maps. And so this is a very important thing in geology. Always check things out. Always check for yourself. You can discover things which have been overlooked. And it doesn't mean in the latest revisions. The latest revisions are any more accurate than the previous ones. And this is one of the excitements. I came down here as a survey and thought, this isn't supposed to be here. But it's a very interesting deposit. In Plymouth, where this is named after the area of Staden Fort in Plymouth, the rock apparently shows structures related to being laid down by a river. Here, I haven't actually sort of had a close enough look of this whole rock face, which is obviously a little bit unstable, to find this. So if we were looking at shallow and maybe slightly deeper rocks over there, deeper marine rocks, alternating. And if this represents rivers, it means it got very, very shallow indeed. The sea dried up effectively, and river sediment washed across the area. So the sea level was going up and down. And this is the whole of the beginning of the process here at Hope's Nose of how we ended up with a coral reef, and then how we ended up losing a coral reef.
So along with the rocks on the beach being incredible, behind us here on this kind of limestone point that you can see just behind me is in fact an incredible fold. Now I'll insert some drone footage for you here so you can actually see, but you can see the layers of interbedded limestone and mudstone, and then it's a really squishy fold, so it's like quite a tight angle, and it's just beautiful. And us geologists love things like this. Like, how on earth can rocks bend like that? So we've just moved further along the beach, and Kevin has just discovered an incredible fossilised surface of some bumpy patterns here. Now, what are these, Kevin?
Well, if you go to the beach, you might see something like this. These are what we call ripple marks. This is where water's been moving, in this case, probably backwards and forwards, and creating lots of ripples. So we know something like 390 million years ago, this was shallow water, maybe no more than a few meters deep, with the water moving backwards and forwards. And these are really, really interesting structures because they tell you something about the environment of formation, because they only form under certain conditions when you've got moving water. As I've been walking along the beach here, I mean, I've not actually seen this surface before. The light is good today, and maybe some of the beach has been eroded away. But I've been seeing things I haven't seen before here. So it's really interesting. An area like this, every time one comes back, one learns some more. So as far as I'm pretty sure that this is the top of the Staden Formation we've seen before, which was that shallow water, maybe even river influence deposit. These look as though they were probably, the shape of them suggests standing water, if not a lagoon, actually then back into shallow marine conditions, shallow seas. But what's happening, also interesting here, just behind us, we see a whole pile in the cliffs of just like a slaty mess, basically. Lots and lots of slaty mud rock, all higgledy-piggledy, tumbled down, lots of scree. And that's the next geological unit. The water has got deeper again. So we've got in the calmer conditions, and mud has settled out, as opposed to sandstone here. And actually, this is the reason why we have a huge landslip behind us up the cliffs here, because these muds just have no real strength. The rain gets in and they collapse. So when you get deposits like this, you often get landslips. And it's a unit which I think goes by the name of the Norden Formation. One can discuss about the names for these things. But the fossils from it indicate this is the beginning of the Middle Devonian. So, as I say, around about 390 million years ago. But we're still sort of like out into the sea. It's relatively deep. There's no trace of any reef or things yet. So what we're going to have to do now is go back up the cliff to find out what happened next. Now, this is really interesting. Again, this is something I've not seen before here. The beach has been washed away, and we're just into these mud rocks, which are now slaty, above the Staden Formation, and all this branching stuff are burrows. Lots of burrows, absolutely stuffed through burrows. These may actually well have been worm burrows, just burrowing in the sediment. So just like another little indication of life in this environment.
So we're now at the top of the landslip, so we've made our way up from the beach, and we're looking at something a little bit different here. So what are we looking at here, Kevin?
Well, You can tell this is a bit of a landslip here. You have a cliff face and a hollow, and just beyond us over there are some ridges. So we're on the ground, which just slips down here, and then there's all that mess cascading down to the beach. But here we have the same mud rock unit. We say mud rock, it's a rock, but it was mud. It's not complex terminology. Most geology isn't too complex. In here, so we've got the mud rock unit, but then we've got some hard bands at the top. Now, if I literally did the acid test, if I had some hydrochloric acid and dropped it on this rock, got a piece here, it would actually fizz. And that would prove it's calcium carbonate and it's limestone. So we've got a complete change of environment here from mud, which was probably quite murky, relatively deep water, into something which is probably a lot shallower. And being that we were in a sort of tropical latitudes at the time, what happens when you go into shallow water? You often get limestone forming, because limestone is formed from the remains of plankton and other organisms. So things are changing again. Things have got shallow, and we're moving into a whole different phase of geological evolution here. So I've got a nice piece of this rock, and there's a little coral in there, and there's also bits of crinoid here, which are disarticulated or broken up stems of an animal related to starfish, but it had a long, flexible stem. And when they died, they broke up into lots of fragments. And we'll see a lot more of those later, because these are really, really important in the story of how you turn a muddy sea like that, not good for many things, into a nice, clean reef. We've now come down to the beach, or the shore here at Hope's Nose, to see what happens next. And if you remember, in the rock at the top, there was a few scattering of bits of crinoid, the sillies, the sea lilies, flexible stem with a starfish. And when they died, the stem broke up into lots of fragments. But here, rather than being just like sort of a dozen pieces, this entire rock is made of fragments of these crinoids. So it's like a sand made of the remains of these animals. So rather than being over there a little bit muddy and not good for a lot of animals who feel to feed, it clogs them up, here we have a nice clean sand on the seafloor. So the seafloor is stabilized. And if we move over here, we'll see what happens next. And now this clean seafloor, a wonderful substrate for things to settle and start to grow. And this is actually a coral here, an extinct type of coral called a tabulate, which would have grown in a sort of domed colony. And it settles on this floor, and it can grow and enjoy life, because all its little polyps which are feeding are not getting clogged up by mud, because they're sitting on a nice clean sand. So that's a really nice one. That's called Heliolites. See the characteristic internal pattern. And if you look around here, see what else is settling down. Oh yes, here. So before, in the other rocks, we only saw like small solitary corals. These things are quite tolerant. They could, as long as the seabed was stable enough, they could still grow in a slightly muddy environment. But those colonies, like the one over there, the Heliolites, and this, couldn't. So, and this is the beginning of like a reef phase in the development of the area. This is a stromatoporoid. It's a type of sponge which produced a hard calcareous skeleton. You can see the lines here, very characteristic. Those are the growth lines. Well, it's not a colony. It's actually an individual, just branching off and like any other sponge. These are really, really interesting because they potentially included some of the largest animals ever on Earth. And there's one on the island of Gotland in the Baltic, slightly older, which is reckoned to be about 100 meters long. And that's just one organism. So they're beginning to settle. All these pale things, these are corals and stromatoporoids. There's now a lot of them. actually here, where it's been etched by weathering, you can actually see the coarseness of the crinoid sand. And then you've got these bits of stromatoporoid sponge. You've got a different sort of coral, a different sort of branching coral. We haven't seen that one before. So a branching tabulate, sort of forming like a bush. And there's some bands in a stromatoporoid there. Or strom. It's easier to say strom. So things are really beginning to happen. And this is basically a lovely, warm, shallow sea, tropical sea. So all the typical reef building groups of organisms can thrive. And here we have more. Sitting in the sand, these different colonies of stromatoporoids. Broken bits of branching corals. And here we are. The rock is now more strom and coral than it is crinoid sand. And there's a lovely big strom banded colony there. And there's another one there. And you can see these are quite rounded. This is a really typical shape of these organisms. In different environments, they would develop different shapes. Sometimes they would grow sideways and bind the sediment and form a proper reef structure. Sometimes they'd be lumpy like this. But there's a lovely surface here which helps to explain why they were that shape. And this whole surface here is just covered in these rounded stroms all over here and here. I mean, this is a 385 million year old seabed. It's quite incredible. We're walking underwater at the moment, but in past times. So all of, oh yeah, and there's even a few corals as well. That is a really, really nice Heliolites. And that is the actual surface of the coral. So you can see where each of the organisms, each of the polyps actually was, each of the animals. These are basically a clone. Every one of those polyps was inhabited by a clone of the first one to settle. And that's the surface. Normally we see in these rocks, they've been weathered, so you see a cross section, but that's actually the surface of the coral. So it's forming like a low dome. But going back to this, you can see all these rounded stroms all like piled up on each other here. Then there's an area with almost nothing in the same layer. Then another pile of them here. And this is like a sort of stromatoporoid log jam. The reason they are round is because they are rolling around in currents in the seabed. So they'd roll around, settle for a bit, grow on one side. Then maybe sometime later, months or the next year, be another storm, they'd be turned over and grow again. But they developed a rounded shape, like a tumbleweed, the famous, in old cowboy films, tumbleweed. And this shows maybe the results of a storm, where all the stroms, some have been rolled in that direction, and some have been rolled in that direction. So begin to get sort of the dynamics, the feeling of this environment. So it's not actually a true reef in the sense that a reef is a wave resistant structure which builds up on the sea floor. This is a more dynamic environment, so it could actually be across the top of a reef in shallow water with storms and tides, hurricanes in this sort of latitude, moving things around. But still a perfect environment when there's a bit calmer for things to grow. So this is a really lovely surface to actually walk across. And there's another lovely little bit over here. And this is one of the other types of coral growing in this environment. These are broken fragments of a branching tabulate coral called Thamnopora. So these would have formed like bushes, like modern stagsworn corals, but they've all been broken up here because they've been hit by one of these storms. So in the quiet periods, they could grow and branch, but a hurricane would rip through and break everything up. I mean, this site is incredible because all of these fossils have been etched out by possibly even centuries of weathering. Just very slight chemical differences in the fossils has meant it survived the rest of the rock being etched out. And this is one of the right reasons this area is very protected, because these are very, very special. You don't really see anything like this. And the problem is, if someone tried to collect these, they'd just break, because all this is the etched surface of the rock. If you tried to collect it, you would destroy this fossils completely, and there'd be nothing for anyone else to see, but you wouldn't even have a specimen, something to collect yourself. It would just be broken up. So this is very much a case just to come and enjoy this, and just imagine being in the tropics, like the Bahamas, swimming around in a lovely Devonian sea. Well, this is an amazing surface here. So I've got down to a low angle to really appreciate it, because these are the remains of stromatophories which formed domes. They would have grown as a big dome on the surface. So this one is nearly a metre across, and it probably would have been about that high. And there's another there, and another there, another over there. These pale, uniformly grey masses. So this is another Devonian sea floor. But in this case, perhaps not quite so current swept, so the stroms could grow into larger masses. But still in between is lots of debris of other sorts of corals, these branching corals, these tabulate corals, all sorts of other small rugose corals, the horn corals. So quite amazing. So there were still storms washing things around. So it's very much like a modern sort of tropical reef environment, with big structures growing, but in between, because of the strong currents and shallow water, a lot of debris. But this still isn't quite a proper reef. These things still aren't quite overlapping and binding themselves together. So we've seen the beginning of the settlement of all the coralline type animals, the coralline sponges, the stroms, the corals, etc. But they're still not building here. We've not seen an actual reef binding structure, something which could actually resist the sea, resist storms. So if we go a little bit further around, let's see what we can find.
So we've moved further round here, and what am I sat on right now? Because this looks quite different.
A whole load of stroms. It's round the corner. We saw these rounded bun-shaped stroms. We saw a few dome-shaped ones, lots and lots of debris, but no real proper actual reef structure. But here it's a little bit different. This is one huge strom through here, 1.5 meters, 2 meters. There's loads more in here, really quite large ones, and these are overlapping. So actually there's enough of them here to actually form a raised a resistant structure against the storms in the sea. So this is probably about as close as one is actually going to get to a reef with a binding structure created by some sort of animal or plant. So this is really, really quite special, this exposure. And one can study it closely and look at all the different growth forms. But something happens a little bit higher up. You've got these big stroms here. And remember, that's all one individual. And we've got some in here. But then we have this layers in here, which are full of broken fragments of corals, even some angular fragments of stroms. And just around here, this is really nice. This is one strom through here, and it's settled on this nice clean sediment made of broken corals. It's actually grown across a tabulate coral, a platy coral here. It's grown around another one here. Then sediment has been washed into it, and then it's grown over the edge of the sediment, and it's grown over another coral here. So it's actually continuing to grow, even though sediment has been washed in, some of this debris is continuing to grow. And there's a lovely dome-shaped coral as well. I said something serious was going to happen. Here's some of those big stroms, but suddenly there are no stroms. All those corals, all those stroms have completely gone. Because what's happened, these layers here are full of layers of mud and layers of very fine-grained limestone, which is like mud. So the corals have been eliminated. The reef is dead. And a different environment has taken over. And within these rocks here, there are lots of little remains of brachiopods. There's a few bits of crinoid, there's a few bits of bryozoan, another colonial animal. So we've gone back to the rocks we saw at the base of the limestones on the other side of the top of the hill. These are identical beds. So we went off from there, from deeper water mud into shallow water thin limestones, into a whole series of coral rich and strong rich facies with actually what seems to be a proper reef, and then we've gone back again. So the water, rather getting shallower and shallower, it's got deeper again. The mud's come in and it's killed a reef. And actually it's even more than that. Above these thinly layered limestones, there's more mud rock. So the conditions are completely reversed. Water's got shallow, a reef has grown, and then it's got deeper again and the reef has died. So life and death of a reef.
And I guess we're very lucky about the environmental change that it preserved the reef, how it did. It's kind of a treasure to be found, really, to be able to see it pretty much as it would have been in situ, just out of the water.
And if it had continued to go up and become land, it would have just got eroded away on land. But because it went back down into deep water, it's been preserved, entombed.
Exactly, entombed, encapsulated. That's a perfect way of saying it. Anyway, I think that's all we've got time for today. So we really hope you've enjoyed today's episode. As usual, the other episodes are linked down below if you would like to check any of those out if you haven't watched them already. But please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and we'll be back with more soon. So thank you so much for watching.
See you. Bye.